Okay, hello, Brad. We're here for take 3 of our virtual book tour. The thing about doing this virtually as opposed to in bookstores is that in bookstores, nobody drops their pants and starts screaming curse words at you.
Let's hope not, right?
It's never happened to me.
Yeah,
But online, people have that capability, and you know what? Damn if they're not going to do it.
that's right.
So on this, our test run, not even our test run, our big premiere, we decided to do it in an empty stadium.
That's right.
No fans. So
Empty arena.
it really is a pandemic level execution.
That's right.
Hopefully by the next one, we will figure out all the bugs on how to mute those who deserve muting, and unfortunately those who don't deserve muting as well.
Yeah.
Welcome to the world of baseball book promotion circa 2020. Before we start, even how are you doing with the pandemic? Are you holding up okay?
Yeah, we were talking about how, so I'm a biology professor and a freelance journalist. I just learned this new term called, apparently I have a portfolio career. You ever heard this term? Where you basically, you do a bunch of different gigs part-time, they all add up to still not very much money, but so I'm our school is shut down for the rest of the semester. We're doing everything online, which is such a headache. Trying to move classes about animals and plants online is not the easiest thing. And that's what I teach, and my program is about is natural history. So it's a challenging time, but as Rance Mullinick says in the Wax Pack, control what you can control, right?
Good. Oh my God, you just dropped baseball wisdom like 1 minute into this conversation.
Good advice.
I'm assuming that nobody in your classes, as you do Zoom lessons, start screaming "fuck Bryce Harper" over the conversation you're trying to have.
Well, we'll see. I'll get back to you on that.
For those who weren't here, that's what was happening.
Yeah.
Good. I'm glad you're doing okay. Things are okay over here too.
Yeah.
And so to recap, we got about 3 minutes into the last conversation. I'll just recap that quickly. We're doing this, as you know, in response to the fact that lots of baseball book promotion events had to be canceled across the country.
Right.
You had a nationwide tour planned for the Wax Pack. And so this is something small we can do kind of in response to that.
Yeah, and I think, as I was just saying, so I just got in the mail, Eric's Stealing Home and DB's Hall of Name. So baseball books are flying in. I know you've got They Bled Blue paperback next week, right?
Yeah, well, I've got it here.
There it is.
Next week, as long as we're showing off books.
Yeah.
Fun with sequestration. Lots of good reading. So let's get into it.
All right.
The Wax Pack is a great conceit. I heard about it when you first contacted me, and I love the idea immediately. On the surface, it's very simple. You get a pack of 1986 baseball cards. We've already established you have props. There we go.
There you
go. You open it up, and you travel to visit the players therein and learn what you can learn. Mm-hmm. What I like about this book is that it starts off one way. It starts off kind of as one idea and ends up as another. And you discuss this within the text. So I'd like you to walk us a little bit through the journey, starting with the early part.
Sure.
How'd you come up with the idea, and how hard was it to pull that trigger on execution?
Yeah. So when I was growing up and collecting thousands of Topps baseball cards, like so many others in that era, I knew the players really well. I mean, like back then, pre-internet, I'm 39 now, so we're talking, late 80s. Our iPhones were baseball cards, right? Like that's what we pored over and stared at. And we can still probably recite, you probably too can recite obscure statistics from, random players from that era. And so I still follow baseball now and watch baseball now, but I realized that I don't really know the players the way I did back then. And I don't, connect with them quite the same way. So I had this crazy hair up my ass to say, well, whatever happened to the guys, the Marty Barretts and the the Don Carmens of my childhood, and kind of where are they now? The ultimate theme that I think, I mean, it's such a universal theme that Sports Illustrated dedicates an issue every year called "Where Are They Now?" Right? And so I've always loved a quest, right? I think what's nice about this book is it's framed as like a search or a quest, which makes it nice from a narrative perspective. And the pack was cool as a device because you just know you're going to get a random sampling of players, most of whom are going to be the kinds of guys that were my favorites as a kid, who were kind of the underdog journeyman types. And so it would give me a chance to write about, I mean, no one would buy a whole book about, I mean, I would, but no one else would buy a whole book about Randy Reddy, right? But this would give me a chance to actually write about him and others by using the pack. And being, maybe you can relate to this too, Jason, that as a writer, sometimes having constraints is a good thing. This is why I'm terrified of fiction, because there's no constraints, right? In nonfiction, there is, there's always the truth out there, and we do our best to get to that. But the constraint of, okay, whoever's in this pack is who I'm going to have to write about. And I'm just going to go with, you think about the analogy of playing a card game, like you got to play the hand that's dealt with to you, right? And so I like that constraint that was put in place.
To give you a compliment, though, I think one of the reasons the book works is because you did not play by that constraint. You inserted the journey as a character, and you inserted yourself as a character.
Right, which is interesting because, so you've been, you're a veteran of the process by now, but me as my first book, it was a struggle. I mean, people have said, why is this book coming out in 2020 when you took the trip in 2015? And it's because I went through years of rejection trying to get it published, because I always believed in the vision that I ended up, executing, which was that to make this work, to make this not just 15 magazine profiles stapled together, it had to involve me as an active character, and it had to have sort of an overarching narrative that would make it more than just a baseball book, right? And so that was what I always wanted to do was, since I am the one visiting all these guys and I can work my own story into the narrative, I'm kind of the connective tissue for the whole book that kind of keeps you going.
Absolutely, you are. So this was a decision you made before you ever set out to write it?
Yeah, I always, in terms of the type of book I wanted to write, I always knew it would be a road trip book. I wanted to have it kind of constrained by the time of the road trip, but with flashback sequences. And I knew that I wanted to be actively involved in the book myself. And, I got a lot of pushback from editors, agents, people that said, we don't like when the writer is in the story. And, why don't you just stick more to sports and baseball? Why is your story part of this? Because I knew that it was an ambitious idea because it was combining memoir with travelogue with baseball. And so how do I tell 15 individual or 14 individual stories plus my own in a compelling way, right? That keeps the reader moving.
Yeah. And I think you did that really well, in part because you're such an open book within the book.
Well, I tell people now, like, my life is, I've always kind of had that attitude in my life, but now literally my life is an open book.
Yeah. You talk at length about OCD and having it and dealing with it and confronting it literally on your journey.
Right.
How difficult was it to come to that point where you were willing to share everything about yourself? You also talk about old relationships and how difficult those are, and
right.
And coming to grips with your old flame is literally part of your road trip. You go to find her. So it's a two-part question. How difficult was it to come to the point where you were going to share so much, and how difficult was it to find the balance point between not sharing enough and maybe sharing too much? Because you found that point.
Right. Yeah, no, thank you. The fact that you think I struck that balance is a good sign. But it wasn't, because I am someone that just sort of lives my life in a very open way. It wasn't that hard to to do that. I've always believed in vulnerability. And again, and we can talk more about this, but if I had to, in the whole process of writing the book, the best advice I ever got from anyone on writing was that the only thing that really matters in any piece of writing, big or small, is the meaning. Like, what is the meaning of what you're writing? And can you encapsulate that in a single word? And so for me, the meaning of this book is vulnerability. And so I would put that on a Post-it next to my computer. And in the writing and editing process, if what I was typing did not serve that purpose of the larger meaning, even if it was a great story or a fun anecdote, it had to go. I had to take it out, right? And so for me, as someone who tries to be vulnerable and open in general, it wasn't as hard to do that in the book. The harder, I mean, the thing that I think I was most pleasantly surprised by was how many of the players were willing to be vulnerable, because that I didn't know was going to, I mean, I can, again, as Rance Mulliniks, control what you can control. I can control what I do, but I can't control what Gary Templeton's going to say when I ask him about, you know, the Whitey Herzog incident, or, you know, ask Randy Reddy about what happened to your wife that had a tragic heart attack, you know, 30 years ago. I mean, these really personal questions. And the fact that they were so open and willing to be so vulnerable, I think makes the books, you know, what it is, and makes it so much better. So, so that was that part. The second part of your question was, how did I strike that balance? Yeah, I mean, it was a constant checking in and sort of assessment of, am I going too much into my own story? There are chapters where I had more, like in the Gary Templeton chapter, he was so forthcoming and I had so much access to him that I kind of take a little more of a back seat in that chapter. Mm-hmm. But then there's chapters like Gary Pettis where I couldn't talk to him because the Astros had this gag order on their coaches. So I knew I was only going to have a limited amount of information, you know, from him and reporting on him. So then I was like, well, this is an opportunity to include more of my backstory, right? Mm-hmm. And I think so in a way, having varied access to these guys made it better, because it would allow me to vary the narrative and the pacing and you know, you can't have too much of one thing where you're going to exhaust the reader. So then again, I also know there are, you know, I've gotten some reviews from people that are like, why should I care about your OCD? Or, you know, kind of like, you know,
I interrupted the first meeting.
some baseball fans, you know, they're so into the stats and all that mm-hmm. like, and, you know, and then maybe some people that, you know, they're just such private people that they're kind of, me being so vulnerable probably makes them uncomfortable, to be honest. Sure. Right. And so even though they don't know me, they're probably reading it like, I don't want to go there with these feelings. I want to stick to just the baseball.
Yeah. I mean, it works in your favor in one way. I mean, you talk to Gary Templeton, you say he was open about the Whitey Herzog incident, which you go into in the book. I think a lot of people have talked to him about the Whitey Herzog incident. Right? It's a baseball situation. Right. He's a baseball player. But you go to Steve Yeager and you talk to him about his father. You talk to Rick Sutcliffe about his father and the various, you know, levels of dysfunction that was in their home life as kids. And they open up in ways that I personally haven't seen. Mm-hmm. You know, I've interviewed Yeager, and I certainly didn't ask him about his dad the way you did. But I think that's one of the reasons. These aren't the typical kind of questions they get.
Right.
So you can feel within the text their deliberation about, do I open up to this guy? Do I talk about what's real and true and has helped make me what I am, you know, for better and for worse? And in a lot of ways they did. And I think that really, it helps the book and makes it very unique.
Right. Well, you know, and I wonder what you think about this. It's like baseball is such an interesting, I mean, there's sort of this stoicism in baseball, right? Where guys are trained to, you know, not open up, to not be vulnerable. And even among fans, people that love baseball, because it's such a father-son thing, right? There's a lot of, I mean, I talk about this with my own father, that my dad is the kind of guy that doesn't really like to talk about his feelings. So the way that he expresses affection is in talking about other things or talking around sort of the feelings. Or, I mean, I think like Field of Dreams, the scene with the playing catch, right? Like in some ways for men, for fathers and sons, like playing catch is a way of expressing love without saying the words.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I think you have that element where a lot of men are very comfortable because baseball allows them to not have to go there. But then in this book, I'm kind of like tearing down those walls, right? I'm kind of like, oh, I know you don't like talking about this, but here, tell me about your father, you know? And so seeing how some of the, and not all of them, I mean, Richie Hebner, right? That chapter is kind of about how he would not let me in very much.
And yet you spoke to his brother, who did.
Right. So when right. And who was very much an open book. But yeah, I think that was always I mean, it was also when you have guys like Carlton Fisk and Dwight Gooden, how do you write about these guys in a way that says anything new, right? Because Dwight Gooden's, I think, written like 3 autobiographies. Mm-hmm. Carlton Fisk notoriously doesn't want to talk to anybody, but he's been written about. He's a Hall of Famer. He has a whole book about him, you know. So I was trying to approach those chapters like with Dwight Gooden, it was going to be, well, it was his oldest son, right? And that was sort of my entry point to tell his story in a new way. And I tried to be creative about guys that weren't going to give me very much access. How can I still get at the essence of their story without necessarily having time with them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and traveling the country, talking to old coaches or school administrators.
Yeah,
does give you some insight,
right?
And even if it's not the ideal insight, sometimes it's different and in some ways better, right? It gives you an angle you wouldn't have had otherwise,
right?
So each of these stories is contained to its own chapter, right? Mm-hmm. Vince Coleman is in the Vince Coleman chapter. He doesn't show up a lot outside of the book. The one through line character is, of course, yourself. Mm-hmm. So we're not able to see character development of the players outside their own chapters. Your development as a character is fairly profound all the way through the book, from beginning to end. Mm-hmm. How would you describe your personal development over the course of the story?
Yeah, I mean, I was very cognizant of not being disingenuous and not shoehorning development too much, in the sense that, like, you take a book like Eat, Pray, Love, right, which everyone knows, and, you know, she had an advance to go ahead of time to go on this journey, which kind of is a little, you know, like, okay. And then, yeah, and then she finds true love, and she falls in love, and it's like, I knew I'm not going to find the meaning of life in 7 weeks on a road trip, right? And so to pretend that that's going to happen would be disingenuous, and that's where I had to, again, push back on some of the industry gatekeepers who want, you know, transformation and big epiphanies and the meaning of life. And it's like, hey, dude, like, I'm not gonna make that up, right? But I think there were more subtle things that I tried to work in there, where I'm learning from these players as sort of mentors, right? And in some cases they're reinforcing or they're adding to stuff I already knew. Because my OCD, that sort of was at its worst back in 2005, and I had gone through this therapy. And so I flash back to what that was like and how horrible it was, but I also had already gotten it pretty under control by the time I took the trip, right? But then on the trip, it was interesting to see a lot of the sort of philosophy of these players that they've used to be successful in baseball and out of baseball, how those things dovetailed with what I learned in my OCD therapy, which is like Don Carmen's whole philosophy about, you know, you can only control your actions, you can't control your thoughts and your feelings, mm-hmm. right? And sounds simple, but it's a pretty profound idea that, and back to my OCD, you know, OCD is just an anxiety disorder in which irrational thoughts, you know, bother you to the extent that you then engage in some behavior, some compulsion to try to make those thoughts go away. Mm-hmm. And what I learned in my therapy and what Don Carmen reinforced is that you can't control what thoughts come in your head. Like you have irrational thoughts, Jason, all the time, right? But you don't
never, not once.
But you don't have OCD, so when the crazy thought comes in your head, you're like, yeah, whatever. Someone with OCD's brain the chemistry is wired such that I would react as if it was a real rational fear. So it's like being able to label that thought for what it is, and then instead of engaging in that compulsion to make it go away, just accepting that that thought is there, and then the more you accept it, the faster it goes away, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of, I call baseball players in the book accidental Buddhists, because a lot of them, without even, like a guy like Jaeger, I don't think he spends a lot of time sitting around thinking about Eastern philosophy and cognitive behavioral therapy, but without even knowing, unwittingly, Jaeger is actually a pretty good Buddhist because he could just let the failure go. And
Yeah,
baseball's full of failure.
sure. There's also a good time around the corner to be had, which
Right.
is something else to think about.
Right. Right.
That's and one other development you went through personally is your relationship with baseball, and particularly baseball players. Like this being your entree into meeting these guys. You started out with a lot of preconceptions about how baseball players are.
Yeah.
Returned, I don't know if you held any of those preconceptions anymore.
Right. Well, it's more like, I'd say, a shift in how we look at heroes and sort of heroism. Again, I mean, in your books, you interview so many players, so you've kind of like, you've gotten used to talking to them. For me, they were still, in the beginning of the book, they're still kind of like on this pedestal, right? Because I haven't talked to these guys. I'm not a sports writer, or haven't written anything about really baseball before. So I'm still like 8-year-old Brad seeing Don Carmen and all these guys. And we know that even as adults, we tend to kind of fetishize athletes as these larger than life heroes and these sort of gods. We buy. I mean, when you really step back and think about it, I mean, no offense to anyone who buys jerseys, but it's kind of weird. You buy the jersey of, I mean, you're wearing a jersey of some random guy's, a stranger with their name on the back, right? I mean, it's like that. As adults, we do that. That's the level of adulation we have for these people. In the book, I describe sort of my shift in looking at them, that they're still heroic, but not because of their baseball accomplishments, but because of the people they are, right? That they are willing to open up and be vulnerable, and to talk about the addiction and the divorces and the disease and the broken relationships with the fathers, which comes up over and over and over again, these sort of how they dealt with that trauma. And so they become heroic to me because of that. And so they're still heroes. I'm still a fan, but it's for entirely different reasons than how it started out. And I think that's reassuring. It should be reassuring to fans and readers to know that we all have a lot more in common with these guys than you realize, right? That they're not that different, other than that skill that they had. Their problems are your problems.
Yeah, we can all be heroic in those same kinds of ways,
right?
Which is reassuring. You talk about this in the text. Let's get down to actual nuts and bolts of this project. You didn't just open up a pack of baseball cards and then write about it. You opened up a few. And although it is true that every card you wrote about came from the same pack, that was not the first pack you opened.
Right.
How many did you go through?
Yeah, I had about a dozen packs. And yeah, I knew that, like, if I just did one, right, and half of them are dead, or they all live in Iowa. I mean, Iowa is a great place, but like, do I want to do a road trip book about just Iowa, right? So I had to think about the narrative too. And so I picked the pack that, I mean, and of course, Don Carmen was in there. So that was a little,
little of a lot.
Putting my finger on the scale a little bit there. So yeah, I mean, I did open up multiple.
Was it difficult to turn down some of the other options that you bypassed in favor of
No, because no other pack had the geographic spread and the difference in teams and the mix of players. I mean, this was really a good mix. Yeah.
There wasn't that one guy you had in your hand who you had to put down and say.
Well, no, I mean, I had again, I did have my set of favorites from that era, like Marty Barrett and Spike Owen. And I mean, again, those I would love to have done. I would have loved for them to have been in the pack, but then again, probably it works better for them not to be, because if I had too many favorites, it could kind of mess with the specialness of the Don Carmen chapter.
Sure. And then that rings through loud and clear. You're affecting for Don Carmen, which I love, because Even unlike a guy like Marty Barrett, who has, widespread acclaim in New England,
Yeah.
Don Harmon is a niche taste as
Yeah.
far as favorite players go.
That's right.
So it was nice to see. This was going to start as a buddy book.
Oh yeah, that's right. Good point.
And
You remember that. See, that's how long Jason's been around. Like, I think the first proposal I wrote about this before I took the trip, which is what I sent to Jason and said, hey, can you give me some advice on some of these things? And at that point, it was going to be, so in the Rance Mullenix chapter, my two buddies who were there were originally going to be on the entire journey.
Mm-hmm. How did you make the shift, and why did you make the shift?
Well, honestly, I think, and they're my two best friends. I think we would have had a lot of fun, but I think it would not have been as good a book. And it was more luck in the sense that one guy got a job and he was like, hey, I can't just take off for 7 weeks. And they're brothers. And the other guy was, once his brother left and he was just gotten engaged, he was like, and he wasn't the baseball. So it was going to work, I thought, because two of us were baseball fanatics and one guy was kind of the comic foil who doesn't like baseball, right? Mm-hmm. But it would have been too much. It would have been trying to cram in too many stories. And I don't think the players would have been as open with me because, talking to three guys versus one, right?
Even a handful of interested trained journalists together won't elicit the same thing as, a one-on-one conversation.
Yeah.
So with the players, you got a hitting lesson with Rance Mullenix. You played Cards Against Humanity with Jamie Kirkman.
That's right.
You unbelievably showed Randy Reddy how to use Twitter.
No, Tinder.
Tinder, see, not Twitter. I meant to say Tinder. Thank you. It would be very believable if you showed him how to use Twitter.
Yeah.
What was or some highlights for you in that regard? And is there any part of one of those stories that didn't make it into the book that makes for a good tale offline? Or offline. It's just us here.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of. No, I don't think there were any of those kinds of things that didn't get in the book. I mean, Randy Reddy was, if I could just have a beer with one guy, it would be Randy Reddy, because he was just such a fun guy. I mean, we went bowling, we drank beers, we went and worked out at the gym, right? And so, I mean, I also I wanted to do those things because I knew, I mean, my whole life, I was trained in magazine journalism in college, and my freelance work has always been mostly about science, but it's been shorter stuff. Mm-hmm. And I always felt like a little bit like we were spoiled in those classes because we got to, do these long form journalistic pieces and about whatever we wanted. And then you get into when you want to do this for a living, it's like, oh wait, no, we're not going to pay you to, I mean, that kind of magazine journalism is so scarce nowadays, right? I mean, everything is short or it's a book. And so I have for years wanted to actually get to practice the chops that I had learned, right? I had honed when I was training. I'd always dreamed of having the space to go long, right? And to actually write a narrative nonfiction book where you're working in dialogue and scene setting details and point of view and applying all of those techniques of fiction to nonfiction, which is what I like to write. Mm-hmm. So for me, this was like a dream to finally get to do that. And in planning how I was going to approach the players and the meetings, I knew it's going to be a hell of a lot more interesting for the reader if we're doing different things. It's also probably going to make the players more comfortable, right? If you're involved in some activity instead of just a straight interview. And I think that, and as a writer, it makes for a much more interesting thing to write about in some kind of often kind of comical ways. Like I am talking to Don Carmen, he's pouring his heart out to me, and there's like a macaw behind his head or like a giraffe, it's like we're at the zoo. And writing about that creates a more interesting scene, I think. And I really looked at, when I mapped out the book, it was like, it's a series, almost it's cinematic. It's like a series of scenes. Each chapter has like 4 or 5 sections, but I almost looked at each one as like a different type of movie scene and tried to kind of plan along those lines.
Yeah, it would be weird if you played catch with every single person.
Right. Yeah.
Well, you would have a point of comparison then.
Yeah.
Um, how hard was it to manage expectations from the standpoint of you had some great interactions? It seemed like all your interactions were at least pretty good, but some were great and some were a little bit less great. And then some you didn't have at all. You never
Right.
found Vince Coleman. You barely found Carlton Fisk. Uh, were you able to compartmentalize it as just part of the process and it's going to be a good chapter no matter what? This is just the story you're given. Or did you kind of beat yourself up a little bit about the fact that this chapter wasn't going to be like the others?
Yeah, I think in the beginning of the trip, like I had a lot of success, and then I hit Gary Pettis, and it was like, and I didn't know till I was like halfway to Houston that he wasn't going to talk to me, because like up until then the PR guy was like, yeah, he can talk to you, and then I get this text that says like, nope, he's not going to talk to you. So it was like the first kind of potential failure that I saw. But you know, I think I was also, well, maybe I wasn't aware of this till later, but any narrative like this needs dramatic tension and conflict, right? So I think in a way I realized as I was starting to write that the book was better for guys blowing me off or not talking to me,
Mm-hmm.
because it would add a little bit of drama. And and it would, I mean, if every guy was this great you know this great guy, it wouldn't be very interesting as a book.
Yeah, no, it worked out nicely in terms of alternating pace. Who was your favorite one to interview? We know who your favorite player among them was, but did you have a favorite either session with a guy or a moment with a guy?
Well, I think the Carmen stuff, I mean, yes, my favorite player, but also the way that he talked about his father dying and his anger in that moment was really intense. And I think that's probably the most intense moment of the whole book. And I mean, again, imagine Johnny LeMaster, that's your childhood hero, right? But imagine, anyone's childhood hero, welling up in tears, talking about their father and their conflict around how much he disliked his father, but he's still his father, and how he wanted him to die when his father had this heart attack. I mean, it's just insane kind of level of emotion. So there's that. And then I think the Templeton stuff, because he was so, what I had read was that I thought he was going to be a little more standoffish, but he was totally like fun and, easy to talk to. And really, I think, wanted to tell the whole story about the Herzog incident. And
Mm-hmm.
I felt like maybe that never really got told in its entire context. And I see why. I mean, it's pretty messed up that he was portrayed the way he was, when the whole incident where he's, flipping off the crowd is because, well, a bunch of guys were yelling the N-word at him right before that. And all of his Whitey and all of his teammates, according to Tempe, heard all of that, but no one spoke up about that when it got reported in the press.
Mm-hmm.
So this very distorted, the press is sort of like, oh, he just reacted to hecklers. But well, yeah, look at what the hecklers were saying.
Sure. Yeah, and your answer to that question, like going right to a very emotional moment, I think is why you were the right person to write this book, because you were able to get those moments, you were able to conceptualize them and
I think
give them the right kind of treatment.
Yeah, I think that like, and if some people have asked, like, it wasn't easy. Like for me, I had to like work up the nerve. Like I know I mean, it could have gone badly, right? I mean, if I asked Gary Templeton about his illegitimate daughter, he could have, thrown his glass at me and been pissed off. I mean, who knows? And so I knew that I was taking some chances and potentially upsetting people. But I think I always tried, like my goal was always to find the essence of these guys, like they're really their character in a balanced way, even if that meant that they might get upset with me, because I've always approached it as like, I'm a journalist here, I'm not a fan.
Mhm.
I have to kind of get to the story that's out there.
Let's take a moment and go to some reader questions.
Sure. Okay.
We had some people weigh in via email in a
Yeah.
very non-disruptive fashion. So CG from Queens says, "Hi Brad, I'm in the midst of reading Wax Pack and I love it. I'm reading that part for you so you can get a little compliment. It's strange reading it in the midst of this pandemic. I find myself worrying about the players and their families at this time. Are you still in touch with any of them? And if so, how are they doing?"
Yeah, well, thank you, CG. Yeah, one of the great things about coming out of this is I've actually stayed in touch with almost all the guys that I talked to. So today, I actually texted Lee Mazzilli, "Happy birthday, Lee!" And
Props.
he made a little heart sign on my, you can do on the iPhone. And I did the same. And Gary Templeton's birthday was yesterday, so I have my thing on airplane mode. But I texted Tempe and said happy birthday, and he wrote back, "Thank you, stay safe." So those guys, I just saw Don Carmen in spring training a few weeks ago before all this craziness hit, and we had lunch together. He got to meet my dad. It was really cool. And again, the levels of surreal keep building up with Don Carmen, where now he's working on trying to write a book, and now I'm mentoring him. So I've actually given Don Carmen like homework assignments about how do you kind of envision, or how do you map out a book and a proposal and all that. And that's just weird, man. Like,
So just to make it very clear for anyone who has yet to read the book, Don Carmen is your childhood hero.
Yes,
you followed as a kid.
I wrote him a birthday card when I was like 9 years old. I had plaques made up of Don Carmen. Yeah. So to be able to, kind of mentor my hero about writing is pretty crazy.
Was there a moment with your dad that stood out? Your dad must have known how you felt about Don Carmen at the time.
Yeah.
What was he like bringing into that encounter?
Yeah. No, I think. I think my dad just, again, my dad's not. Don Carmen is the type of guy. He's a psychologist. I mean, he's all about peeling the onion, right? And like, let's get into what makes people tick. I mean, that's what his whole job is to get into the psyches of Bryce Harper and all these guys. And, because again, one of the things that I also took out of this book where you talked about how we change, I now feel like when I go to a baseball game or any sporting event and people are booing an individual because they make mistakes, like, I don't like that anymore. Like, I don't think that that's okay. I think I get like booing the team, or maybe even the Astros, because that was like a different level of offense. But if a guy makes an error or strikes out, because we often, even though these guys are multimillionaires, whatever, but believe me, like, they hear everything, right? You go to a game and they act like they're not hearing anything. Like, these guys hear everything, and it affects them and it hurts them, and they, again, they're just people. So I've kind of shifted my tune on that. But so Don Carmen is, when Bryce Harper goes into a slump, which everyone does, it's Don Carmen that goes and gets him out of it by talking about the psychology of things. My dad is not a touchy-feely guy, so in our lunch, it wasn't like my dad was, going deep in that way with Don Carmen, but that's not what my dad does. I think my dad just appreciated getting to talk to him about baseball, and Don kind of indulged with a lot of great stories from when he was a player. And he said, like, John Walkenfuss was just not not the easiest guy to get along with. It's like just random stuff like that came up. Joe Morgan when he was a rookie. So I think my dad loved those stories, that Don Carmen shared with him.
Don Carmen has a Joe Morgan story from when Don was a rookie.
Yeah, when Don was a rookie. He said Joe Morgan was so good that he, one of those stories where he, like, Carmen's on the bench as a rookie, and Joe Morgan says, he had just struck out or something, and he says, "Watch this. Next time I'm going to get an inside fastball. I'm going to pull it to left field," and basically like called his exact shot and then went out and did it.
Yeah, there's a reason guys get to be as good as Joe
Yeah.
Morgan. Kevin writes a lot of very complimentary things. I will get right to the question. which is there a player you wish would have been in that pack after you opened it, especially for replacing the checklist? One of the cards you got was a checklist.
Right. Yes, the checklist. I've always wondered, like, should I have done something different with it? I just put it in the epilogue, but it was kind of an enigma. What do you do with a checklist, right?
Well, you could have gone around the country and actually checked off every single one of those guys with another round of conversations.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. There were guys. I mean, I had my favorites from that era. Like I said, Marty Barrett. I always liked Steve Lake. Remember Steve Lake?
Sure, the catcher.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe it was the mustache. I don't know. I just like that guy. And Spike Owen with a funny name. So I had a whole set. Dennis Lamp. I don't know. I like Dennis Lamp.
You like single syllable last names that begin with L.
So I think, yeah, those guys would have been, I mean, and again, of course, all, the common theme, these are not star players, right?
Mm-hmm, exactly.
So I would have enjoyed those guys as well. Yeah. I wonder, someone asked me, do I think I would have gotten the same story with a different set of guys? And I think I would have had a lot of the same themes, but I think if you opened a pack from, let's say, 2010 or 1998, like, you would get different themes in different eras. Mm-hmm. It'd be interesting. So I bless whoever out there wants to do this, the next wax pack, go out and do another era and let's compare and see how it is.
Well, Kevin is also asking you to do Wax Pack 2. So
yeah.
You now got that on your shoulders as well.
I mean, with the exception of The Empire Strikes Back, is there any sequel that, or maybe The Godfather, that's as good as the original?
No, just The Godfather. Just The Godfather. All right, let's close this with a question. I'm going to put you on the spot. You are a biology professor, as you mentioned,
right,
at Merritt College in Oakland. You are also the school's director, I'm reading this, of natural history and sustainability.
Right.
We need to get into exactly what that means.
Right.
I'm going to ask you to draw a connective line between the natural history of the islands of California, which is one of your courses right now,
yeah,
and baseball.
Okay, let's see. Well, islands, what makes something an island is isolation. Right, that's the defining characteristic of an island. I mean, literally, an island is a section of land surrounded by water. But island is a great metaphor, right? That just represents isolation. Baseball players are, I would argue, in some ways, the most isolated of all sports, because baseball is this quasi-team sport. The isolation of Don Carmen on the mound. I mean, literally, it's an island. It is an island itself, the pitching mound. And you've got one guy who's in control of so much, who really is out there on his own, right? So I think that's something that is thematically interesting to me. Is what is the effect of isolation on in islands? Isolation leads animals and plants to evolve in weird ways. In baseball, isolation means you have to be that much tougher mentally to get through, because you're alone with your thoughts, and there's a lot of failure in the game, right? So all these guys that played baseball at this highest level got there not because they were the most physically gifted, but because they had the talent upstairs.
Okay.
So how was that?
Perfect. I don't know if that was me beeping or you beeping, but time is up. Brad, a terrific chat. Thank you very much. This space will be graced with your presence again, as well as mine.
Yeah, I look forward to our group panels too.
Yeah, thank you to anyone watching and listening. Pandemic Baseball Book Club, pbbclub.com, and we'll be posting advance notice for all other kinds of chats we're going to do. Hopefully, we'll have the technology lined up so we can actually have users who do not disrupt.
Including perhaps a series of conversations between me and Jason about the 1985 San Francisco Giants.
Yeah, we've been discussing that as a possible podcast project. If any of you are out there among the San Francisco Giants from 1985, Brad, great talking to you.
All right, man. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Bye, everybody.